Billionaires Row in New York City set off a super slender skyscraper revolution. Today, the towers are an astounding display of wealth, prestige, and engineering firsts. But they're also kind of empty. Meanwhile, finding an affordable apartment in the city as a non-billionaire can be nearly impossible. So we wanted to know, what makes something like Billionaires Row possible? And what impact is it having on the world of wealth, architecture, and construction? Especially watch today's video to the very end to find the answer to the pressing question. Why New York's Billionaires Row is half empty, pushing the bounds of engineering. Just south of Central Park sit some of the most exclusive homes anywhere in the world. There are no official gates to Billionaires Row, but the name refers to a handful of buildings on and around West 57th Street. Nestled alongside iconic New York landmarks like Carnegie Hall, the Russian Tea Room, and the Plaza Hotel, you'll also find 432 Park Avenue, 53W53, 111W57, 157, and Central Park Tower. A little further out, you have 220 Central Park South, 520 Park Avenue, and 252 East 57th Street. Skyscrapers have slowly been getting taller and thinner for years, but Billionaires Row has given rise to a new form of skyscraper entirely, the super slender residential tower. In Manhattan, space comes at a premium, which means if you want to build big, you have to build up. To develop the small sites they'd secure with buildings tall enough to offer Central Park views, developers on Billionaires Row spent years acquiring the air rights for the properties around their lots. What that means? That meant that they could combine those new air rights to build their property taller and ensure those nearby buildings won't block their newly built views of Central Park. It's sort of like piecing together a very expensive puzzle. New York's building code considers a building slender if it has a width-to-height ratio of 1:7. But the towers on Billionaires Row go far beyond that. 157 was the first of the bunch to complete in 2014 with a ratio of 1:8. Then came 432 Park Avenue with a ratio of 1:15. From there, 53 West 53rd, 111 West 57th Street, and Central Park Tower all joined the ranks of super slender skyscrapers on Manhattan's skyline. Today, the thinnest of the bunch is 111 West 57th Street. The 85-story building is officially the world's thinnest skyscraper. It's just 18 meters wide but rises to 435 meters in height. That's a width-to-height ratio of 1:24. And of course, when you're 400 meters in the air, you have to think about the wind. Engineers have a few tricks they can use to keep the building from swaying too much, like constructing setbacks on the building's facade, leaving the glass out of mechanical floors, and installing a tuned mass damper at the top of the building. Of course, we do have to acknowledge some of the issues that have cropped up now that construction has finished. Residents of 432 Park Avenue sue the developers for a series of construction flaws, including flooding, power outages, faulty elevators, and a noise caused by the building swaying in the wind. How wealth is reshaping our buildings? Now, there's a logic to the super slender tower. The taller you build, the more value you can squeeze out of that small plot of land you were able to find on Manhattan Island. To make the construction of a super slender tower worth it, you have to make those units really expensive. That's where luxury real estate brokers like Ryan Serhant come in. Billionaires Row is a pretty global demographic in a global city, so there's a lot of pieds à terre, so part-time owners. There's a lot of investor owners, Serhant, founder and CEO at Serhant, told the B1M, we're selling the penthouse right now for 432 Park for $169 million. The owner has never been there and it's an investment. It's an asset. It's like owning a Picasso. Billionaires Row has essentially created an entirely new asset class of luxury real estate. That's partly because there's simply a lot more money to go around. The amount of money being invested around the world has grown massively, creating what some researchers call a giant pool of cash. New York City's regulatory loopholes. Even with the money and engineering to make buildings like this possible, super slender skyscrapers can't just pop up anywhere. Developers need permission to get the projects off the ground. And there are restrictions on how tall developers are allowed to build. But in New York, there are a lot of different loopholes developers can jump through to go beyond the limits. That's where something called incentive zoning comes into play. Zoning is a set of rules that establishes the shape of the city. Things like how tall a building can be and how much space must stay between structures are all covered in the city's zoning policy. Why so many units empty? For all the effort, money, and planning that's gone into these buildings, it's striking just how many of the units seem empty. It turns out there's a couple different reasons for it. They're either unsold or simply unoccupied. There are quite a few Billionaires Row properties still on the market. An analysis by Surin found that nearly half of the units in 7 of the buildings were unsold in August 2021. That's $6.7 billion worth of condos still on the market without a buyer. That might be because what was initially unique about 157, the Central Park views, floor-to-ceiling windows, and units sprawling an entire floor, was quickly replicated by the other super-tall residential towers that popped up. Now, if you're in the market for an ultra-luxury apartment in Manhattan, you have a lot more options. More supply than demand. For years, the luxury real estate market in New York City had more supply than demand, but that's starting to change. By September 2021, Manhattan hit record-high sales of luxury properties, according to a report by Miller's Samuel Douglas Elliman. But perhaps the more interesting case is the units that are sold but nobody leaves there, at least not all the time. They're second, third, or fourth homes, or simply just a way to store their wealth. Every few years, the city of New York does a big housing and vacancy survey. In 2017, they found there were 75,000 pied-à-terre properties across the city, up from 55,000 in 2014. Atom Data Solutions found that in the 2 zip codes where most Billionaires Row properties are located, roughly half of the single-family homes and condos aren't occupied by their owners. In the rest of the city, the owner occupancy rate is closer to 75%. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean all of these units are sitting empty. They could be rented out by their owners who live elsewhere. But none of the Billionaires Row developers would share their occupancy rates with us. And this data gives us a glimpse into how the area around Billionaires Row compares with the rest of New York. Zombie urbanism. There's a term in Professor Sowell's book called zombie urbanism. It's used to describe a place that has a lot of housing units that are owned but not lived in most of the time. It's not quite dead, but not fully alive. Sort of like what's happening now on Billionaires Row. But the phenomenon isn't unique to Midtown Manhattan. In Paris, second homes are on the rise, and in a handful of its districts, a quarter of the homes are sitting empty. Some of the most expensive neighborhoods in London are eerily quiet at night, as many of the properties are second residences. In Melbourne, experts warned an entire district in a prime location could become a suburb of ghost towers due to unused property. And over in Toronto and Vancouver, tens of thousands of apartments sit vacant most of the year. I would say these buildings radically matter to everybody, Professor Sowell said. The kind of system that produces those towers in Billionaires Row is the very same system that produces slums, homelessness, and affordability crises. Proposals around the world. So, where does New York go from here? The city is in an affordable housing crisis, and it's not likely these empty luxury condos are going to be used to house the people who really need a place to live. We think you'll see more people buying apartments for $50 to $100 million in 10 years than you'll ever see before, which obviously means that there's going to be a very noticeable wealth gap in the world, as the wealthier get wealthy and the poor get poorer, Servant said. And so who always gets screwed in all of these kinds of global financial shifts are the middle class. And that's the people who really do the work. Calls to rethink. Across New York, there have been calls to rethink the city's zoning policies and how condos are taxed. Paris, Vancouver, and Singapore, and soon-to-be Toronto, all have some form of tax on vacant apartments. In Berlin and Barcelona, the government has threatened to seize empty buildings and turn them into affordable housing. In 2019, New York state lawmakers proposed an annual recurring tax on second homes value at more than $5 million, but it was derailed under intense lobbying from real estate groups. Instead, lawmakers embraced a one-time fee on the sale of multi-million-dollar homes. I hope that in 10 years' time, we look back at Billionaires Row as a phenomenal mistake and a dozen missed opportunities, Stein said. The skinny pencil towers on Billionaires Row are the most dramatic manifestation of this new world we live in, Professor Sowell said. They are architecture as spatial financial form, not as shelter or cultural manifestation. With that, we end today's video. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Lastly, join in a next time for more of such interesting content.